Welcome to the EarthWorks podcast, where our team will share the jargon of carbon from many of our turf friends from the past 30 years.
This week we sat down with Tom Cook, who is a retired instructor of turfgrass management from Oregon State University. I didn't know a lot about Tom before we had this conversation, but if you've been in the Northwest or have spent any time in the Northwest, chances are you've run across Tom. And back in the late 70s, he had an opportunity to establish a new program at Oregon State that really has shaped the lives and the careers of a great number of superintendents that have since spread around the entire Western U.S. Great conversation, great guy. Really hope you enjoy the conversation, and if you enjoy what we're doing, please subscribe to the podcast wherever you get your podcasts.
Hi, everybody. It's been a little while again since I've been on the EarthWorks podcast, but I sure appreciate everybody tuning in. I'm pretty excited about this one. I've got Tom Cook, retired instructor from Oregon State, on with me, and maybe some of you nationally don't know who he is, but he's I'm going to fill his head full of compliments here, but he's an icon in the Northwest, and has definitely touched a lot of lives in our industry in this part of the world. So Tom, thank you for coming on. I appreciate it. It was a little prompting from a mutual friend that got you involved here, so you can blame him for that. But one of your former students kind of pushed me on this, and I think it's going to be great. So thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
So before we got on the recording, I had, probably like a lot of people in the industry, I had assumed that you had a PhD, and you said, well, I'm actually not a PhD. So let's start with that, since you kind of got rolling on that, and how that all came about.
Well, I'll kind of go through some background. I went to Washington State University for a bachelor's degree.
Okay.
And about the time I finished there in agronomy and soils, the jobs weren't really great. So I had an opportunity to go to graduate school at the University of Rhode Island. And at that time, they had a powerhouse program. Dick Scoglie was there, and Noel Jackson, Richard Hull was there. He was a real star plant physiologist. And I worked with a guy named Tom Duff. And Tom's claim to fame was that he was the first graduate student of James Beard. So
wow.
Yeah, so they had a strong program, and I went there and got a master's degree. And the plan, of course, was that I was supposed to go on for a PhD, but I decided I didn't want to do that, and I had an opportunity to work with Roy Goss at Puyallup, Washington, where the experiment station was. So I went there on soft money, thought we'd work for a couple of years, and then I'd come up with a new plan for my life. And towards the end of my stay, Al Law, who was a professor at Washington State, he wrote me a letter, and he said, Tom, I've already recommended you for this position. You have to apply. So I looked it up, and it was at Oregon State University in the horticulture department, and they actually advertised for a master's or a PhD, which was unheard of, because I assumed I would never get to go to a university because I didn't have a PhD. So I applied, and the upshot of it is that they had 4 candidates, and apparently 3 of them were terrible, and they hired me. And my assignment was 100% teaching.
Okay.
Initially.
That was going to be one of my questions, was what the balance was.
Yeah, initially it was 100%. It was a fixed term position. It wasn't a tenure track position.
Okay.
And my boss, believe it or not, our department head was named Bud Weiser. And he was part of the cold hardiness group back in Minnesota in the day. And turns out it was a good marriage. He was a great boss. But the first thing he told me, he says, Tom, you can do anything you want to do. Just don't ask me for any money. So I took him at his word. And I inherited a bunch of students who had been in the crop science department. And they turned out to be really good guys. Tom Christie was one of them, John Ford, Bruce Faddis, a number of others. And so we were off and running. I had no resources, had no facilities.
So this is what year?
1977.
And there was not a specific turfgrass management program at that time?
No, there had been on paper a program in the originally the farm crops department, and then eventually the crop science department, but they didn't teach, they only taught one class, and it was a general class, 2 credits for anybody that wanted to take it.
Okay.
So they, at the time I arrived, what they had done is they combined the landscape architecture program at Oregon State, which had got axed because in the state we couldn't have 2 programs, and there was already one down at the University of Oregon. So they took the design people and brought them into our department, and then I was supposed to start up the turf program, which was really a turf and landscape management program.
Sure.
So we started from scratch, and I had a rototiller and a lawnmower, and that was it. And
humble beginnings.
We did all our work initially on campus. The building that I ended up in, the Ag and Life Sciences building, hadn't been constructed, and it was part of parking lot and other things. And right next to it was the old farm crops building, which had a lawn. So we used that for our variety trials, and we planted things on campus. And that was a challenge because all kinds of vandalism occurred and such. So then we eventually moved over across the river to the Lewis Brown horticulture farm, and started planting grass and kind of went from there.
Okay, so I want to get into a little bit on the research side, but for those that aren't aware, the location of Oregon State is in Corvallis, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So describe that and the weather, and I might be bouncing around a little bit on my questions, but why is that a place that we'd want to establish a turfgrass program?
Well, if you look at an aerial view of the Willamette Valley, Corvallis sits just about dead center.
Yep.
The midst of this wonderful agricultural area. So we grow, of course, most of the world's grass seed there, but it's also become a hazelnut mecca. Yep. And there's every conceivable vegetable crop that you can grow. So it's right in the heart of this fertile valley. Oregon State University is a land-grant university.
Right.
And so it's always had a strong ag and horticulture component, and that goes way back. The actual first class that was ever taught at Oregon State in landscape or turf management was listed in 1935. But that part of the program never really developed until Norm Getzey came along as part of the crop science department. He only worked with graduate students, but he had a couple of notable ones. One in particular was Vic Gibo, who spent his career at UC Riverside and was one of the first to study annual bluegrass as a diverse plant from annual to perennial types.
Right.
So we had a number of graduate students. Richard Schwabauer Sr. was a graduate student there. He was a longtime superintendent at Waverly Golf Club in Portland. But the teaching program never took off until I got there, and so we started to expand the offerings. Like I say, I inherited some students who turned out to be good folks to start with, and then it sort of built from there. And the program kind of stumbled along for 4 or 5 years, and then it started to take off. We started getting a lot more students into the program, and the jobs were plentiful. And then we had just this run of talent. It felt like I was at USC football or something. They just
well, it's funny how many people I run into that have gone through that program and had you as one of their primary instructors.
Yeah, it was a neat program. I had them for a whole year at a minimum. So I saw them every term, and I taught a lot of classes. At various times I taught as many as 8 different classes, and that included turf, landscape, irrigation design, fertility management, you name it. If it had to do with turf and landscape, that was my class.
So your master's was in what discipline specifically?
I studied cold hardiness and tall fescue.
Okay.
And it was in a turf situation. Of course, the only tall fescue in those days was Kentucky 31.
Yeah. Yeah.
And ugly as it was one tough bugger.
One durable plant, wasn't
oh goodness, yeah, you take your life in your hands to walk across it. It
it?
was
Yeah.
coarse and ugly and all the things we associate with wild types. So I studied potassium fertilization as it affected cold hardiness. And of course, it was a neat study, but it didn't amount to much. We didn't have much impact on cold hardiness of tall fescue.
So this program was just yours to craft.
It was. And in the department, horticulture deals with a tremendous diversity of crops. And so everybody was into everything from corn to filberts to grapes to all that stuff. And then turf were just sort of out there by itself.
Right.
And in the context of the department, I was sort of an outsider and people left me alone. And I found ways to get money to support my teaching programs. And that was what I wanted to do, was to build up not so much a research farm as it was a teaching laboratory. So we had about 10 acres worth of facilities at the Lewis Brown farm, and built primarily by the students. Every year we'd add a section and they'd put in the irrigation, and they would do a multitude of field projects out there.
Right.
And so it was a great opportunity for them, but also for me to watch them and see how they function.
So the way you describe it, I was right at the interim between Dr. Deutsch and George Hamilton's tenure at Penn State.
Mm-hmm.
And George didn't have a PhD at the time. In fact, he was working through that a couple of years after I left, and I think finished it just before he passed. But it's interesting, and the way you describe the program, or at least the early years of the program, it sounds a lot like the technical type of training versus the university. But the flexibility was there too for you to kind of build the curriculum the way you wanted it.
Well, there's always been sort of a uneasy tension there, because I feel that if you want to change the industry, you do it through students, not necessarily graduate students, but undergraduates. They're the folks that are going to go out and work for a living. And they're very practically oriented. They're goal oriented. They deal with a broad range of things. Turf isn't just about rhizomes and stolons.
Right.
It's about managing people. It's about understanding the situation you're in at a golf course, in this case, or even at large landscape facilities. So there's a lot more to it, of course, than just being a scientist and being an expert in turf. And so there was always that tension there. Our students didn't come here to become a research scientist. They came here so they could move out into industry, make a living, perform well in that arena. So we geared that whole program to interacting with the industry, constantly interfaced with the golf course people that I knew, and
Sure.
Did a lot of field trips, got a lot of input from them. All of our experiments that we conducted at the farm were very directed towards golf and the needs of the golf course industry, and also for sports turf and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So it was very much an integrated program into the industry of turf management, as opposed to just being a scientist.
And likewise, I assume, the way you're describing it, you definitely took a lot of input from the industry to try to fine tune and tweak the program as it went along.
Yeah, it was kind of interesting, because there were a lot of jobs available at that point in time. I think that was just happenstance. So our guys would go out and they would get jobs, and of course they would want to hire good kids. So they would take on our students as interns. And then one by one, as they began to move into the industry and they started to dominate the Northwest, all of the country clubs, most of the resort courses were OSU grads, because we do have kind of an unusual climate. It's different than anywhere in the United States. And so they got jobs. Then they began to, give back to the program and help us out a lot. And they've always been generous in that regard with their time. They donated equipment. They work behind the scenes to generate the Oregon Turf Foundation to create a source of money. We were never in a position to compete at that time for large research grants or anything like that. I was just too busy teaching and didn't really have that time frame. And so we did a lot of practical research with everything from herbicides to growth regulators to fertilizers, anything we could to generate some income that way. But it was the former students that really carried the ball and started to funnel money and to our program. And then that just built on this legend, if you will, that you can come to OSU, get a degree, and you've got great opportunities
right.
as a superintendent.
So I know Brian McDonald's been a fixture at that university for a long, long time. What was his role as you were there?
Well, he came back as a student, and he was like a lot of students. He was older. He had a degree in another field. He had several degrees. He was a really bright guy. He was an accountant. And
really? I didn't know that.
he started out in that direction, which would prove to be wonderful because his knowledge of financial management at golf courses, for example, was extraordinary. And he was the ultimate turf nerd. I mean, he really liked turf, and we became fast friends. And he sort of set the standards for all the other students in my classes. And he was always on point and focused on what was going on. And then, I had been there 20 years, and I'd struggled to generate enough money to do anything other than just get by from day to day. And I finally had accumulated enough money that I could hire Brian when he finished. So he had done multiple internships at golf courses, and he would have been an excellent superintendent and all that. But he said yes, and he started working for me. So he quickly took over significant parts of even my teaching efforts. Anything had to do with money, he was the guy, and he was really good with computers. So he developed all kinds of spreadsheet systems for helping students to develop budgeting knowledge.
There's that accounting background. Really fun.
Yeah, and then he did all of our spray work, which was a great means of generating money for the program.
So this was about what year? Was it 80s?
Well, let's see. We've been in the 1990s, I think. Yeah.
So you were basically flying this ship yourself for that many years.
Oh, when we started planting stuff at the Lewis Brown farm, I had to take my own lawnmower from home. I mean, that we're talking pretty basic stuff here. And and my wife and my son helped me plant all the plots, and and he was just a little guy then. So it was pretty touch and go for a long time.
I guess.
And I did it all myself. And then I finally got money to hire somebody in the summer, a student to help out. You're talking a pretty low rent operation there for a long time.
So how did the university recognize the need for it, even though maybe there wasn't adequate funding for it? What, it's always interesting, not only on the front end of it, but now, and we'll hopefully get into this here in a few minutes, but how these universities have decided to shutter all these programs. So let's start with how they decided this was an important thing to offer.
Well, that's a good question that I've asked many different people over the years. Is what, why did this happen? And
why am I here?
Quite literally. And I talked to President McVicker. He was the president when I got there, and he was an interesting character. The university ran at a pretty low rent approach too. He had one vice president and that was it. Now we got a dozen of them.
Right.
Only now they're called vice provosts. But so I talked to him one day and I said, why did this happen? Why is there a turf program at OSU? Because there really wasn't a lot of support for it. And he said, well, it was the right thing to do, which was a very diplomatic thing for him to say. But behind the scenes, you had, I think, Nat Justina, who was an Oregon State grad. He had a big forestry business, privately owned forestry business with a family, the Justina brothers. And Nat was a golfer, and he was as hard-headed and as driven as anybody I've ever met. Tough guy to get along with, but he was a major supporter. And he also pushed through the development of Trysting Tree Golf Course, which is the public golf course associated with the university now.
Right. And later became one of your de facto test sites for a lot of things, right?
Yes, we did. We've done a lot of work, and we continue to do a lot of work there.
Yeah.
Brian spends half his time doing plot work there. So I think Nat may have been a driving force behind all this. And of course, when I finally retired, they endowed a position, the Justinas endowed a position that Alec Kovaleski has now. So that the position, the program would have gone away without that. And
Right.
but
or
so
may
that
never started in the first place, right?
yeah, and so it's interesting. At the time I came to Oregon State University, historically these programs had all been supported by state money from state taxes. And then we went through the tax revolts and all that sort of thing. People didn't really want to have their taxes going to education, I guess. And so it shifted, and it's continued to shift, and it will always be that way. And that you're expected to go out and find money outside the university. So you do that either by being a fundamental scientist,
Right.
or you do it by working with industry and gaining industry support. And so our program has always been strongly supported through industry and through organizations such as the Oregon Golf Course Superintendents Association and the Northwest Turf Association,
Right.
that sort of thing.
So OTF had been around, I would assume, right? Or
Yeah.
did they kind of get started at the same time?
Well, they were started by former students who recognized the need for a larger amount of money to come into the program. And, Gordon Kiyakawa, Bob Sensman, some of those guys were real integral. And before them, it goes way back to Rich Scholes and some of the folks that are long since retired.
Right.
And they came up with this plan to organize that. It's originally through the Oregon Golf Course Superintendents Association, and then it morphed into the Oregon Turf Foundation, and I'm not sure what they call themselves now, but they became really strong supporters of our program, and that's enabled us to, you can get money for salaries, but then you need money to operate on.
Sure.
And so. And then when I retired, first Rob Golubieski came in, and I had built up as much money as I could for him to get started and that sort of thing. And then he left to go back into industry, and then Alec came on board, and both of their positions were different than mine. They didn't teach any of the landscape related classes. In fact, they don't teach nearly as many classes as I did, but they have research appointments. And so Alec has been very effective at finding money through the USGA and other sources, as well as the money we get through our spray work and then of course the Oregon Turf Foundation. So he's done a great job in building up a research program, which is absolutely key to this whole program surviving.
Right. But at the same time, it kind of takes away from the starting model that you built, right? That you're there to train future industry leaders or future folks for the industry.
And that's a challenge. And although it's interesting, when I was there, we started out with a handful of students, and eventually built up to, we had a core of about 40 people, which was not large, say, compared to North Carolina State or Penn State or Michigan State, whatever. But it was a really, it was half the department. And then when you added in the landscape students, we clearly had the dominant group. And a lot of that was based on the fact that there were jobs.
Right.
I mean, The reality is that the idea of a liberal education where you learn all kinds of things about everything else, that's great. But college had gotten so expensive, there's got to be a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow,
Yeah.
and these kids need to get a job. And so that could happen in the golf industry. Golf industry was one of the few industries in horticulture that pays living wages. And I think our students all came in motivated. They knew what they wanted to do. They wanted to be a golf superintendent. And some of them had degrees in finance, they had degrees in economics, they had degrees in sociology, they had degrees in English, but they loved golf and they wanted to be golf superintendents. So they were really focused. These guys were laser, in their approach towards
so
their studies.
So the majority of them had golf experience before they even came to you.
Yeah, they'd worked at golf courses, and that's been a major shift that's occurred. Back in the day, I started working at a golf course when I was in high school.
Right.
And first thing a guy did is put me on a tractor and put me to work, and you didn't even think about it. You just did it. Everybody worked. All the kids, they either bucked bales or they picked apples or whatever, but they all worked in the summer, and so that's just the way it was. But today things have changed a lot. The number of high school students that graduate and have never held a job has increased dramatically.
Yeah.
Part of it is the general affluence of our society, but there's other factors, and I'm not all that privy to it. But I do know that there's a whole different core of people out there that don't understand the amount of work it takes to be at a golf course and stuff like that.
Yeah, I think, right or wrong, I think sports has to play a role in that. I've got my youngest son is a senior in high school this year, and he's got a couple of friends that have never worked a job because they're always doing travel sports, and it's I think it's definitely another pull. But it, like you, I started on a golf course really young, and it boggles my mind that you can get through high school without a couple of dollars in your pocket. Like, how do you even how do you take your girlfriend out for an ice cream cone?
I mean, I started mowing lawns for money when I was 12 years old. And I did that for 3 summers and loved every minute of it. Didn't know what I was doing, but I could push a lawnmower. And then I got a job at a grocery store, and I quickly realized that was the last thing on earth I ever wanted to do.
Yeah.
And then I had started playing golf when I was 14, and I spent as much spare time up there as I could. I mean, we could buy a junior membership for $10.37 because they had tax in Washington. And so we bought this membership. I could play any day of the week except Men's Day and weekends unless I was with an adult. And so I got my money's worth out of that.
Boy,
and I hung around so much, the guy finally said, "Hey, you want a summer job?" And I yeah, and I remember that because I worked there and I loved it. In those days, we actually irrigated our fairways with sprinkler pipes. So I moved sprinklers twice a day. So each one was 12-hour sets. So that was the ultimate deep and infrequent irrigation.
Yeah, no kidding.
We had a Ford tractor that pulled a 5-gang tag along, and that was our fairway rough and everything else. We had Jacobson 321, greensmoors that sort of worked sometimes. And so basically it was a 9-hole golf course. I got to do everything, and it was just delightful.
And this is in Washington State?
Yeah, a little town called Okanagan. It was the Okanagan Valley Golf Club.
Yeah.
I had the best boss in the world, guy. He owned a grocery store before he took this job. He and his wife, Pete and Leona Peterson, and Pete was just lazy enough that he'd let me do what I wanted. He'd always tell me, he said, "I'm going to show you how I do it, and as soon as you can do it as good as me, then if you want to try something different, you go right ahead."
Yeah.
And he was true to his word, and I started cross-cutting fairways and striping and all that stuff, and he let me do it. And so it was wonderful.
I had an assistant years ago. He had a similar attitude to that, but a little bit different twist. He said, I'll take a little bit lazy in our employees. And I thought, that's not really what I want to hear from you. And he said, no. He said, you understand, if they're a little bit lazy, they're going to figure out a more efficient way to do things. So
Yeah.
as long as I watch them and figure out what they're doing, then we
Yeah.
win. I said, okay, I'll give you that.
Well, it's funny, this golf course was a homemade golf course, and they had originally planted Kentucky bluegrass. It was in north central Washington, so
Right.
it was very similar to Idaho and
Yep.
so on. And so by the time I got there, the course was be 25, 30 years old, I guess. And I didn't know anything about grass, but I did know that in the low, wet areas on the golf course, we had the prettiest grass, and it was nice. And I also noticed that in the bluegrass fairways, which we probably mowed closer to an inch, it's pretty high in those days, that there were these spots, there's these patches of grass, and then on the putting greens, I noticed that in the spring they flowered a lot, so that was all I knew about grass. And then later I figured it out that the pretty grass that I liked so much was all annual bluegrass.
That was the enemy.
Yeah, and then the patches in the fairways were all bent grass, and
sure.
so I figured that out after the fact. And it's interesting. We mowed fairways, believe it or not, they are not fairways, but putting greens 3 times a week.
Yeah.
Now, when Poa annua was flowering, it was like putting over a forest stubble,
Oh, man, I'll bet.
And so, and we probably mowed at 5/16. I mean, talk about a shift in the whole concept of maintenance. And even the great golf courses at that time probably didn't mow below a quarter. So
yeah, I came on in the early 80s at 5:30 seconds, and we were pushing the envelope at that.
Oh, yeah.
Was, and triplexing fairways. I was a Midwest kid, so that was the in thing.
Well, when I was in college, I worked at High Cedars, which is a brand new golf course that actually Roy Goss and Milt Bauman and Glenn Proctor had designed. They were local. Of course, Goss was an academic, but Milt Bauman was at Seattle Golf Club, and then Proctor was at Rainier Valley or someplace. And so they designed this golf course, and so I went to work there in the summer, and that's when Jacobson came out with their first riding triplex Greensmore. And holy moly, you had handlebars like bicycles.
Right.
And the hydraulics weren't real powerful. So sometimes when you hit the button to lift the reels, they came up one at a time.
Yeah.
And so it was funny because I mowed greens and tees all summer long with that thing. And I was so bad at it that by the time I got done mowing a green, it looked like I'd hand mowed it because I kept trying to straighten my lines and they kept getting narrower and narrower. Oh, yeah. So that was an interesting point in time, that this transition from the old ways to the new ways.
So you mentioned that you built things to the point where you had about 40 students, and I assume that's across the 4 years.
Yeah.
So about 10 graduates a year.
Yeah. So we would pump out about 10 guys a year, and we had a strong internship program. And I know I always counseled the students. I says, look, first of all, if you're 21 years old with a degree in horticulture, no one's going to hire you to a responsible position.
Right.
I mean, you're not old enough. You're not ready. I said, so if I were you, I would take extended internships. I'd work 6 months here. I'd work 3 months there. If you could take 3 internships before you graduate, heck, take a year off and work for somebody that, if once you're 25, people start to listen to you and you've got that much more experience and so on. So we had quite a few students, if they could, they would do that. And then many of our students were older. So they were already in that 25 to 30-year-old range. So it was easy pickings for them because they had the experience, they had the age and the maturity, and then they could move into these jobs. And it was a real winning formula. But it was just, I always said I kind of ran a dating service because, some of the kids, it's really interesting. You've got the people who think they know everything and don't. You've got the people who don't think they know anything and do. You've got the people who have lots of confidence. You have the people who are really shy. You've got folks that need a mentor, someone to really guide them along. You need other people who could just take off running. So I could place them with superintendents with all these different personalities,
Sure.
and I had enough connections that I could help them get jobs or encourage them. It wasn't so much that I helped them get a job. It's like, don't be afraid to apply to Augusta for an internship,
Yeah.
And I used to tell them, I said, the reality is what they want you to do. They want you to show up on time without a hangover, without being on drugs. That's what they're looking for. And they're looking for basic decision making, like, gee, I should fill up the tank on the gas, on the lawnmower before I take off. I mean, they're not expecting you to run their whole golf course. And,
right. So in other words, nothing's changed.
Nothing's changed.
Maybe become that much more elemental, right?
Yeah, it's harder to find people who can show up on time. So
yeah.
But so it was wonderful, and then of course once my students got jobs, then I knew them really well, and that worked great in both the golf course and the landscape industry too, because I had a lot of great students in the landscape industry. We've got several of our strongest supporters. Bob Grover's one at Pacific Landscape Management. He's just, as he says, he bleeds orange, and he's done wonders for the program. And
I think everybody through there bleeds orange. There's not too many wishy-washy people that have gone through Oregon State, I can tell you.
Well, it's funny because, having gone to Washington State, I always had this, when I was in high school, we had the worst football teams we'd ever had. When I was at Washington State, we had horrible football teams. When I went to Rhode Island, the highlight of my time at Rhode Island was the coach got stopped by a state patrolman on his way to a game, and he didn't have his license on him. So he spent the day in jail while the Rhode Island Rams got hammered on the field. And then I came to Oregon State, and they were in the midst of a 28-year losing streak. So I kind of blamed myself. So the one game of the year that always worked out was when Washington State would play Oregon State, because I couldn't lose that game. So,
right. That's funny. Yeah. So, okay, so we're on the vein of students, and I want to bounce a little bit, and then I'm going to get back to that. But my question for you, because obviously we've seen a huge contraction in the number of schools that are offering opportunities in turf management. Is that the fault of the industry? Is it just kind of a changing of the tide, or lack of support? Because you look at, I came out in the early 90s. The golf boom was in its heyday. Anybody in my class could have picked wherever. All they had to do was pick a location on the map, and they could find a job. We're right there again. And yet there's no talent to speak of coming out of the university, or so much less than there was when I was in. I mean, in Lake City, there were so many more programs. What happened?
Well, I wish I had the answer. I have lots of ideas and thoughts on that, and one of them is, let's take, for example, Roy Goss. Mm-hmm. Basically, he got a PhD for doing a study on fertilizers on turf. Now, today we do that as an undergraduate project just to demonstrate.
Yep.
So that was cutting edge research. And at the time, in 1960 or so, whenever he finished. And then the trouble with science is it keeps going, keeps getting more sophisticated. Right. So everything now is about molecular biology. Well, meanwhile, back at the golf course, you're still mowing grass.
Right.
And so the research emphasis at universities has shifted more and more towards serious, hardcore science. And so where does that leave teaching programs that are teaching folks how to take care of a golf course or that sort of thing?
And where does it leave employers looking for quality employees?
Exactly. And so the emphasis, and you're seeing it at OSU. I mean, the emphasis now is on training graduate students, getting more sophisticated science. If you follow Michael Wood's stuff, I mean, all this science, and that's great. But at the entry level into the industry, it doesn't work. So colleges have become more basic. And so who are you going to hire to do that? Are you going to hire a guy like me who has a lot of practical ideas, or are you going to hire someone who's more focused towards basic science?
Right.
And so Alec is doing a great job, I think, of bridging that gap, but he still depends heavily on funding that that he can get, as opposed to what the molecular biology people can get through NSF and other major things. So, and then you had the rise of the community colleges and the 2-year programs and things of that nature, which are very valuable. But there's sort of that disconnect then between a 4-year degree. And then I think you have to add to that the reality is that when I saved money all through high school, and I was able to pay for pretty much my first 2 years of college out of my own pocket.
Sure.
And then I did have to borrow some money to finish school, but my total debt by the time I had a bachelor's degree was about $4,000.
Yeah.
And once I got a job, I paid that off in 1 year. Well, school is really expensive now.
Right.
And so it trends towards kids that come from affluent families. And the old idea that, you and I can apply and work our way through school it becomes a big challenge.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Yeah. So I think that's had an impact on the number of students who start college. And so I think it's a very complicated formula, but I do think it's also a lack of awareness on the kids' part of opportunities that exist out there.
Right.
If you've never worked at a golf course, then you don't know what it's like to work at a golf course.
Yeah, and I know there's been a push for tapping into the 4-H programs and FFA and things like that. And I think those are certainly, very important pipelines to try to tap into. And the First Green program obviously is a potential gateway for that. And I think those all play a part. I'm surprised that clubs aren't doing more scholarshiping, but I don't know that they've got the long game mentality enough to realize that, even when I was working my way through school, they had, for lack of a better way of saying it, they had almost like an indentured servant sort of program where they would pay your way as long as you stuck around for 2, 3, 4 years.
Yeah.
I wonder, but you're right, boy. I put a couple kids through college, and fortunately there was some scholars, some academic, and some athletic stuff. But it's a big nut, and if you're not going to get the return, although even some of that is pretty questionable. But the thing that baffles me is you actually would get a return on a turf grass management program.
Oh yeah,
degree, because there's such a deficit of grads coming out.
I think that the industry certainly has to step up. I mean, the reality is, if the industry doesn't support it, it's going to go away.
So what does that look like? Supporting OTF and the Northwest Turfgrass Association,
basically money. It all boils down to we need more endowments. We need bigger endowments. Again, these are all a turf management program is a labor intensive program.
Sure.
So the actual money that's required to maintain plots and do all this stuff is a fairly high proportion of the total budget. So we need to be able to support that. If I could do any one thing, I would endow more academic staff, but I would also endow research support staff, guys like Brian McDonald, the folks that make it happen. And then I would pump tons of money into scholarship opportunities for students, so that we can get people into the program without being $100,000 in debt.
Yeah.
Because that just isn't going to happen otherwise. But I learned a long time ago, we can't depend on state support, at least not in the Northwest. Maybe there are a few states. North Carolina State is an example of one, I think, that gets really good support. But we can't. That's not the emphasis of folks in this part of the world. So it's got to come outside of that. And it's either got to be through the golf industry, which have, let's face it, I mean, golf is one of the few aspects of horticulture where there's money available to support things.
Right.
I used to try desperately to get money from the various grass seed commissions. They didn't want anything to do with it because Northwest really wasn't their market. That was,
even though that's where it's all grown.
yeah. There's a great irony there.
Yeah.
There's a tremendous irony is that, yeah, we grow grass here, but the grasses that they produce don't generally perform very well here as a turf. So it's a real odd thing. But industries can be really short-sighted, I think, looking out at their bottom line day to day and not realizing that they're investing in the future of an entire industry. So we need more of that. We also need to cultivate young kids. We need to get kids working at golf courses.
Right.
And, wealthy people send their kids to play at golf courses, but they don't send them to work at golf courses.
Yeah, but again, I think you mentioned this earlier. There's a mentorship mentality that a lot of people in our industry do have, and I certainly don't want to speak disparagingly of it, but we've all hired high school and college age kids to work. Are we selling it as a viable alternative to a career that they might be that they might not even be thinking about at that point?
Well, when I went to college, I started college in 1968.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, well, I'll be a math teacher and I'll be a football coach.
Right.
That was my frame of reference. I liked my math teacher in high school and I love sports. So, and then I was home one summer and I was working at the golf course and I met with a local extension agent. Woody Woodrow was his name. Really nice guy. He was a farm crops guy. He had nothing to do with turf. But he talked to me and he says, you should study agronomy and soils. And I looked at him and I thought, okay. And I didn't want to admit that I didn't know what it was. So I went home, I looked it up in my Webster's dictionary. And even after I read the definition, I didn't think I knew what it was. So I went to college next year and I changed my major to agronomy and soils. And so the first class I took was a forage crops class. Mm-hmm. I didn't even know what forage was. And I learned how to cube and wafer, and I learned all about alfalfa and that sort of thing. And I'm sitting in these classrooms, and all these guys are farmers, and I'm not a farmer. And they all had plastic covers for their cowboy hats in the winter. They had special cowboy boots that were waterproof. I mean, these guys were the real deal.
Right.
And I'm sitting there and I don't have a clue. And it turns out they were great people and I loved them. And we had an incredible class and all that. But that was my introduction to the academic side of turf management. I didn't even know you could study turf in college. And so I know when I came to OSU, I wanted to make sure that my students understood that there were opportunities here. And so, yeah, I think sometimes we don't do enough scouting and enough mentoring. And, you be on the active lookout for kids, and that means going to high schools and finding ways to get kids to look at golf courses or landscape companies, whatever it may be, as a potential career source, because they really just don't know. I think that's it.
And then make sure the industry is supporting the foundations that are funding these. I mean, if there's a silver lining in all this, there's so few programs left regionally that we should be able to pool our money and at least support the ones that are left, right?
Well, I mean, you look at what happened at Washington State University.
Right.
Roy Goss ran that program at Puyallup, and it was a class program forever.
Yeah.
He was there at the beginning of the Northwest Turf Association. He produced the newsletters. He did all this stuff. And then eventually they developed plot work at Pullman. and then when he retired and Bill retired, and boom, it just went away.
Yeah.
And there's nothing there. University of Rhode Island, where I went, they had a powerhouse turf program, and it just went away.
Yeah.
And partly it was that the people they would hire to come in to do research couldn't find the amount of money they needed, so they would tend to veer away from turf grass stuff and go towards more basic science things. And it's survival of the fittest. At the university you have to publish, and publishing means journals, and journals are rated, and you have to move in that direction.
Right.
So
So
the support's got to come from the industry.
So I wonder if the fact that you weren't a holder of a PhD, if that really kind of kept you in a lane that was needed, and didn't distract you in having to write those papers and having to go out and do some of the things that are, that through no fault of their own, that every professor in the remaining turf programs invariably is having to do, right? And so that takes them away from the classroom.
Yeah. I lucked out. It was completely luck. I mean, it was, I didn't have a plan
Right.
and I didn't understand the system. And when I started OSU, you could be promoted on your merits of what you were doing for the Pacific Northwest.
Sure.
And then we decided we were going to become world leaders, and you had to have an national reputation, and you had to be a wheel. And meanwhile, I'm just chugging along. I'm getting as much money as I can from industry. I'm having phenomenal success with my students. I'm not creating any waves in the department, that sort of thing. And so, I skated right through. And, I couldn't get promoted to full professor because I didn't have this long list of publications, but I didn't really care about that.
That may have been a blessing in disguise, right?
Yeah, I was having fun with my students. I told my boss, I said, look, I'm successful doing what I'm doing, and that's what I'm going to keep doing, because I can't just switch to directions now.
Right.
But I also knew that going forward, that the rules of the game had changed, and the next guy in was going to be under the gun immediately.
Yeah.
And Alec came to us with a good pedigree. He'd already managed to figure out the publication business, and so he's thriving and doing, whether I would rather be the teacher, but doing what he's doing is making this program work. And
he's built a good team around him too.
Yeah, and he's got great people working with him right now. Brian and Chaz and Emily and so forth. And he's got some good graduate students. And the only thing that's lacking at this point is a critical mass of undergraduates. But that really isn't. That's not his problem. That's industry wide.
Yeah.
This summer I went to England. We went to their tour gardens over there. I'm a real garden nut. And I went to a famous garden called Sissinghurst down in Kent. And I was talking to the head gardener. I got to meet with him and get a private tour. And he said that they had some internship positions open. And he said, in the past, I would have had 50 applications. Mm-hmm. But he says, this year we got 2. So this is a worldwide phenomena, and it covers not just the turf industry, but the landscape industry. It's sad.
Interesting. Well, I think it's incumbent upon all of us in the industry to do whatever we can to support those that are left, and encourage people to get into the industry to fill those gaps. It's a supply and demand thing. I'm optimistic that the demand is going to create salaries that support people thinking about it as an alternative or a viable career path, for sure.
I do, and it's not a field that it's front and center growing up. Everything is computers now and all that, and making kids aware that this is an opportunity. It's out there and it's good, and it is a tough business, and that, and I know that. It's a 24/7 thing. You have to be committed. You have to surround yourself with family that supports what you're doing, because by golly, if you got a heat wave coming, you're not going to go on that vacation, And
That was that's a good segue. So I go ahead and finish your thought, and I need to ask you a question here.
So it is. I always used to say that we didn't need a lot of people. We needed a few really good people.
Sure.
And so kind of the Marine Corps mentality is that there's only certain people that are suited to this kind of work. And we need to find them and get them involved because the opportunities are outstanding.
Yeah, the trend. So the question I have in relation to that, the trend, every generation knocks the next one, right? I don't care. Your generation is knocked mine, and mine knocks the kids coming out, and I think that's just a cyclical thing. But the good and the bad, and I really want to see the positive in it, and I think I have in a lot of cases. The next generation of, and not just golf course employees and superintendents, but just in general, seem to have a much healthier work-life balance mentality. Mm-hmm. And I've got 2 married kids that one of them definitely maybe has too healthy a work-life balance, but they do just fine. And like you said, it's an incredibly demanding field. And Mother Nature does not look at a calendar, nor does she look at your kid's baseball schedule, nor does she, any of those things. And yet, one of the things I hear time and time again when I visit with superintendents is, we just can't get guys to have the people that have the dedication. So I think that's one of the things, and I wanted to ask you about, can this career be mastered with that approach?
Well, I think the answer is it has to be. We have to find a way, a different model that I know I certainly grew up with, that if I take responsibility, then it's on me.
Yeah.
And I'm going to make it happen. And that meant a pretty small organizational structure. So the key is to develop an organizational structure that accommodates the reality that people have lives outside of their work, and that they need to be able to function as human beings and not sacrifice. I mean, how many of my students have lost families because they just couldn't find a way to get away from work enough to be a participant in their own family? And that's a reality. And most of them are lucky to find people that understand, but still it's tough.
Yeah.
We have to find a way to do that. We have to find a way to improve that work-life balance.
Well, you answered it exactly how I had hoped you would, but that's the reality. And I think that, the fact that we have to figure this out, that gives me a lot of optimism. I think there's so much of it that is self-induced, because you have people, maybe they come out of a farm background, or maybe they come out of an agriculture background, that it's just go, 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 go. But if we're going to pull people from other walks of life to fill the voids, we have to adopt that. And I don't think that's the worst thing in the world. It's probably incumbent upon clubs to accept that more than it is, the industry specifically.
Well, and I think I see those trends in a positive way. Once upon a time, you didn't have an assistant; you had a mechanic,
right.
You had a spray jockey or whatever. So we went to the assistant route, and now we've got second assistants, and so we've got enough bodies in there that we have the ability to cover. And we're always struggling at the guys that mow, the people doing all the daily mundane tasks that have to be done. But we've found ways to tap into labor pools that can do that. And but having enough expertise at the golf course that you can go away for the weekend without worrying about losing your job. Mm-hmm. That's we got to find a way to do that. And,
Yeah.
and I see it at some of the better clubs, a lot of the clubs, guys are doing this. But I also know clubs where it's still on the superintendent 24/7, 365 days a year. And that's a recipe for burnout.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I think as things contract or have contracted in the past, the superintendent throws more on his shoulders, and that, like you said, that's a recipe for burnout. And somehow we have to kind of shift from that mentality. I think technology is driving some improvements and changes, and maybe easing the burden a little bit. We're a ways off on some of that, but all of those,
I think someday, that it's going to be common to mow fairways robotically.
I agree.
And
I agree.
I saw it throughout England at these major gardens. Now, many of these gardens have 400 acres. They're not little tiny backyard gardens.
Right.
Most of the gardens we went to were using robotic lawnmowers.
Interesting.
And it works. And they kind of the old school technology with the buried wires and the random patterns. But with GPS now, you can get fancier approaches. It's kind of a funny side story is that you can always tell a lawn that's been mowed with robotic lawnmowers because it'll be damn near perfect. And then there'll be a tuft of grass that didn't get cut because everything is random. They just go back and they figure if we go over it enough times, I'm gonna mow everything. But there's always a spot where the grass was 6 inches tall.
But the perfection is the only reason you notice that, right?
Yes,
Everything else is just right.
And the lawns were beautiful, and then you have these little cutouts and hedges or whatever where they hide at night while they get recharged, or during the day while they get recharged. But you have so much flexibility with that. So I think we're going to continue to see more technological changes.
Me too.
And so that'll help things, and that'll also attract students with lots of computer savvy and technical knowledge, which all kids seem to have. You may sit in your office with a joystick and mow fairways. I'm not sure how that works, but
well, if there's one universal trait that golf course superintendents possess, it's their ability to pivot and to adapt to different situations, and I think that's going to be the saving grace in the industry.
I think there's lots of opportunities, I think, to draw students from a broader perspective. And one of them that I've seen in my career is this shift in the idea that we just dominate nature to the idea that golf courses can be a very environmentally healthy environment.
Yeah.
And that in the oasis of the city, a golf course it isn't just a chemical dump. It can provide all kinds of environmental services. So
that's a whole nother podcast, because I totally agree, and I think there's lots and lots of things that we probably don't toot our own horns enough about, especially in the inner city situations. But I'm looking at the clock here, and I can't believe that we're already at an hour. I told you this would happen. It happens every time.
Yeah.
So what I do at the end of all of my discussions, Tom, is I have a lightning round of 5 questions, and you and I don't know each other quite as well as some of my other guests. So I kind of, there were some pot shots here, but you teed up the first one really well. So my first question for you is, in your few years in the industry, what's the one greatest innovation that you've seen?
I think that
I'll preface your answer with, I've never had the same answer twice.
Yeah.
Which is what makes this question so interesting.
In the golf industry, I think the single biggest change that has occurred that had an impact on turf quality was growth regulators. Our ability to learn how to use growth regulators.
The streak continues. That's a good answer.
It has, we have damned and condemned Poa annua forever, and yet that's our basic grass in the Northwest.
Right.
And with the advent of growth regulators, we've been able to produce it to perfection.
Yeah.
And so, I think that there's many, but that's one that comes to mind.
No, that's a great answer. Okay, this was one I was a little nervous about, but you put my mind at ease. So you're obviously a sports fan. Football, baseball, or basketball?
Oh, football.
Okay. With that, pro or college?
college.
I would have expected that.
Yeah.
Okay, last light one, and then I got a really heavy question for you. Are you beer, wine, or other?
Other.
Other. Okay. Um, you're kind of in wine country, though.
You know,
It's not your cup of tea.
yeah, it's not my cup of tea.
So, okay, so last question, and boy, there'll be some people tuning into your answer on this one. What happens to the two teams left in the Pac-12? And isn't it ironic that they were the only two that had turf programs?
Uh, you know,
What's your gut? What happens here?
I don't know. You know, you look at both our programs are strong football programs at the moment. I mean, we're as good as all the major teams in the world.
It seems like they've really come out with
and
something to prove this year, right?
and they haven't. They've got the talent.
Yeah.
Why we didn't get picked up by a bigger conference, I don't know. I don't think it's just a media thing because there's lots of backwater teams in various other, you know, Stillwater, Oklahoma is not exactly any different than Corvallis or Pullman. Sure. Somehow I think we're going to end up either in the Mountain West or we're going to have a reformulated Pac-12, and the teams are there. I do think we're going to see different conferences for different sports. So we have a strong gymnastics program at Oregon State, and they're going to find their own conference. Same thing with all the other sports, basketball and so on. But for football, somehow we've got to end up in a conference that has quality teams and enough money so that we can continue to attract the caliber of players that we've become used to. I mean, we got a brand new stadium in Corvallis. I mean, this is a magnificent stadium.
Yeah.
And to have the rug pulled out under our feet with that is just, it just makes you want to cry.
Well, you know it's going to work out somehow. It's just everybody's speculating as to just how it is. And I'm a big Gonzaga basketball fan.
Yeah.
And you know, there's the same talk with that program and that school, and what do we do with them if they join a football conference? And you know, so there's a lot.
I do have one prediction,
okay.
Which predictions aren't generally worth much, but the teams that left the Pac-12 to go into the Big Ten or the ACC or whoever, at least half of them are going to regret that decision sooner rather than later.
You know, the logistics are the thing the geography and the logistics are the thing that really confuse me. Now, I think COVID maybe opened some doors with some online teaching that we didn't have in the past, but that's going to be a tough one because you're in some cases you're talking an extra day of travel on both ends.
Well, you know, I'll give you an example. Years ago, I went to the GCSA conference in Atlanta, and I got an award for something, and that was a big deal. And one of my friends at Iowa State University showed up, and I thought, that's amazing. And she said, well, it was just an hour and a half flight.
Right.
You know, and I remember when I would go to meetings, say at Pinehurst. Okay. Well, I had to get there a day early.
Yeah,
because the meeting started the next morning.
You're preaching to the choir here. I totally understand.
And so it's all the logistics is going to be a big issue.
Yeah.
And the other thing is that moving into some of these conferences like the Big Ten, you know, every week you're playing a top-notch team. There are no breathers. There's no respite. So they're going to find that it's a lot harder than they perhaps think it is. And I don't think all the money in the world is going to change that. So, so I see that we're going to go this direction, and I would be surprised to see things change again and the reformation of some sort of a West Coast conference.
I think you're right. I think you're right. That's kind of where my gut is too. So
let's hope.
Well, yeah, exactly. Tom Cook, thank you so much for coming on. This is a great discussion. I really appreciate it. And you know, I think if there was anything to be gained from this, it's the fact that the industry has to support those that are left so that we continue to to keep a pipeline going for talent
we need to find
need.
ways to get students on campus under the tutelage of people that are passionate and connected, and help them move on into the industry. So.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, and stick around for a minute, but I just want to thank everyone for listening. If you haven't, make sure you subscribe to the podcast, and we'll see you again next week.